Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse, live from the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now, the dust is settling on the final day of the year's meeting. The theme had been a spirit of dialogue, but world leaders now find themselves reassessing their global relationships, having been shell-shocked by the U.S. president's foreign policy. Their focus now returns to Ukraine, having been distracted by Donald Trump's Greenland ambitions. Now, we'll unpack all of the week events with today's guests, including the head of the World Trade Organization, the South African finance minister, and the astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti. But first thing is first, let's check the markets as we do every day. Now, U.S. futures actually pointing to back-to-back weekly losses for the S&P 500 for the first time since June. There has been a bit of a turbulent stretch, I would say. The dollar headed for its worst week since June, and then emerging market stocks, currency extending a strong start to 2026. The gold, this is significant. Gold briefly rising above $4,950 an ounce. Now, the Finnish president warned this week that the Greenland issue was sucking all of the oxygen out of Davos at the expense of Ukraine. So let's discuss Greenland in a moment, but begin with the Russian war. Officials, of course, from Washington, Kyiv and Moscow will meet in the UAE today after the Russian president hosted the U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Moscow on Thursday. Their talks lasted 4 hours, but the Kremlin says they stalled over the issue of territory. Now, in a speech here in Davos, the Ukrainian president criticized Europe for failing to take action against Vladimir Putin.
No security guarantees work without the U.S. But what about the ceasefire itself? Who can help make it happen? Europe loves to discuss the future, but avoids taking action today, action that defines what kind of future we will have.
Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook in Brussels. Now, Ollie, when you look at talks in the UAE, what are the chances of progress towards ending the war?
Yeah, Francine, for the Europeans here, after a sort of rather scenic and very long sort of a detour towards Greenland, the focus geopolitically is now once again on Ukraine and those talks that are happening now between the United States, between the Russians, and also the Ukrainians. Let's just remind people, because Ukraine has been thrown so far to the back burner over the last week and a half, the sort of structure is that 20-point plan. It got some edits from the Europeans and the Ukrainians. They went over to the Russians, got a pretty lukewarm reception, and now we have the U.S. team that went to Moscow yesterday. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner spent 4 hours speaking with Vladimir Putin, but it seems that they've made no breakthrough on the very last issue and the very sort of biggest issue, which are this question of territorial concessions. The Russians wanting to take basically all of the Donbass, wanting that to be part of the agreement. The Ukrainians very resistant to sort of sign on to anything that looks like that. There is some good news, though. There seems to have been progress, and there seems to have been settled on the issue of the sort of U.S. security guarantees, so that is certainly something helpful. But as you were mentioning there from Zelenskiy speaking, that everyone seems so concerned about the day after, we're still in the day of. So today in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, what the U.S. is hoping to bring into being is trilateral talks that would include the United States, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. Not clear necessarily if they will all be in the same room at the same time. That is the hope. It could be bilateral talks, 2 pairs of them, where the U.S. is the go-between. The U.S. talks to the Russians, talks to the Ukrainians, then is the go-between. But that really is the ambition here. And it would really be a very positive signal if they manage to all sit at the table together. And we'll find out later today if that is possible. Those talks are supposed to be today and tomorrow in the UAE.
Ali, meanwhile, Brussels, of course, in Brussels, tensions over Greenland seem to have eased. The EU is moving towards signing a trade deal with the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. So you'll remember that earlier in the week, basically, the European Union suspended their vote, parliamentary vote, on whether or not to bring into being that trade negotiation, the trade deal that was negotiated last year between the United States and the EU. That was sort of delayed indefinitely. It seems now that's going to go back in front of the European Parliament, and that will pass without any kind of issues. But Francine, after we sort of spent this last week here in Davos, as you have sort of listening to everybody, it feels like we've spent basically a year in Davos dealing with all the geopolitics and trying to take stock about how the European and American relationship has changed after that week. I think it probably has changed fundamentally. We heard some much tougher rhetoric. Really, the sort of person carrying the flag for everybody was Mark Carney, but we heard very, very strong rhetoric from a number of Europeans where it seems that this was the sort of line for much of Europe. And I think that the real sort of dawning realization for Europeans, though this has been building for a full year, as it comes to Donald Trump, that basically now they feel anything can be weaponized, and this is not a drill anymore. This is the real deal, and the Europeans need to figure figure out how to deal with that and how to respond to that. Key to that, Francine, will be the one issue, the one we always talk about, European unity. Can they stay unified? We saw a real rallying behind Denmark. The question is, will that last for a long period of time? The European nations have had a slightly different idea of how to approach Donald Trump. Emmanuel Macron going much more aggressively. Friedrich Merz, for example, trying to go a little more tenderly. I think there is an idea and a growing consensus in Europe that you do need to act a little bit harder if you want to get Trump to back down. But again, we have domestic politics within Europe, within France, within Germany. They're going to get a lot of pressure and sort of fragmentation there. The question will be, will the Europeans be able to stay united in order to take on Trump, who will still be there for another 3 years?
Ollie, thank you so much. Oliver Crook there, Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent. Now, Bloomberg understands that the U.S. is seeking to rewrite its defense agreement with Denmark to remove any limits on its military presence in Greenland. Speaking on Air Force One after attending the World Economic Forum, President Trump told reporters that the U.S. would have total access to Greenland.
That was discussed. We can do anything we want. We can do military. We can do anything we want. And it's being negotiated, and let's see what happens. I think it'll be good.
Well, with us now, Hélène Landemore, a professor of political science at Yale University, and Chad Thomas, Bloomberg's executive editor for Europe. He's also been in charge of our Davos coverage. So thank you both for joining us. Chad, it's been quite a week, and actually a lot of people, say, what's the main key takeaway? So, and there are different lenses. It could be, it's Mark Carney asking for, if not a new world order, like people to support, Canada, maybe sign alliances as a counterbalance to the U.S.
Well, I think one of the main takeaways is that a deal with Donald Trump is never really a deal.
Yeah.
That if you think you've signed something and it's over, if there's something that he wants from you again, that whole deal is reopened. We saw that with Europe this week with the threat of new tariffs because he was upset that they were pushing back on Greenland. I think that the other takeaway is that Europeans finally this week pushed back on their side as well, and that got him to back down. There was also some opposition at home, even from Republicans, over the Greenland threats, so that played into it as well. But to me, the key takeaway is that a deal is never a deal, and you heard a lot of Europeans saying that. Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, said, look, we signed an agreement with you, and now you have to stick to it. But if he wants something, the tariff threat is always on the table.
Yeah, so this is really weaponizing, tariffs, Professor.
It is. I would say for me, the main takeaway is indeed that we've buried the post-World War II international order with, Europe scrambling to reinvent itself painfully. I think I agree that Trump is coming off as a mafia boss that you cannot really trust, although if you stand up to him, actually it works. The other takeaway for me is that we barely talked about Iran. And I'm heartbroken over what's going on over there. And I'm grateful to Zelenskiy for actually making a point about that, about how people looked away. And
yes,
we shouldn't.
So, Professor, is there a danger, which we felt actually here, is that the president focuses on something, and all of the attention of everyone, leaders, media, everything, is on that issue, and so everything else is forgotten.
Exactly. Yeah. No. I came here to try to change the focus from elected leaders to civil society, the shy, the people who are not present in this room. I hope we can do more with that and kind of try to bring the voices of people who are not heard, including people in Iran, but not only, so that this conversation are just not focused on what elites care about.
I think that's part of why we heard such a fiery speech yesterday from the Ukrainian President Zelenskiy. Ukraine was not the main topic in the first days of Davos. Everyone was talking about Greenland. In the meantime, he's sitting in Kyiv where there are power blackouts because of the Russian attacks on the country. And he really was basically shouting at European leaders, please do something. My country needs your help.
Yeah, Chad, how do you view, there's, of course, the reaction of the European leaders was mixed, right? So France wanted to be much more aggressive in terms of negotiating tactic with Donald Trump, but Germany was like a little bit shyer. A lot of it is psychology. This is not like, it's not negotiation. It's like, how do you take the president so that you kind of get what you want from him without antagonizing to him too much?
So I don't know that this was intentional, in other words, that they had put together a plan, but there seemed to be a bit of a good cop, bad cop going on. You had Macron here and really laying into the president and the U.S. for its tactics. He departed Davos, though, before the president ever arrived. The people that were then here on the ground talking to him, it was Mark Rutte, who has really aligned into him and has really worked to build that relationship. It was Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, who also has good relationships with the president. Those were the people who were really trying to talk to him about Greenland and to try to come up with a deal there. But essentially also with Germany, of course, they're just so dependent on the U.S. economically that it's hard for them to come out and really hit hard. That said, they also were privately saying that if they have to take some of these tougher measures, they're ready to do that. You had the German vice chancellor saying that Greenland for Germany was also a red line.
Professor, what did you make of President Trump's speech? Again, a lot of people said, oh, he backed down because he said he wouldn't use military force against Greenland. Like, is our radar a little bit off?
I know I heard people say that. My interpretation was kind of the opposite. I'm probably wrong because I'm in the minority, but I heard a mafia boss say, look, you're either going to give it to me or look at all these planes and all these, weapons I have. I just felt that like very much threatening, actually. But again, I'm probably not savvy enough in all these diplomatic undercurrents. I think it's a disgrace that this is the tone of the leader of the free world. A disgrace.
He also followed up the, I'm not going to take Greenland militarily with, we will remember those who don't give us what we want.
Yeah, and that's definitely like a huge fight. What do you think will happen in Iran?
I don't know. I'm usually not for interventions, but in this particular case, I do think that they made an implicit promise. I mean, Trump tweeted, help is on the way, that led directly to people being massacred by this lunatic. So I think at that point we have a moral duty to do something, and I don't know what it is, but something needs to be done.
What kind of negotiations do we know? I mean, and it's true, Iran was hardly mentioned, actually. It was just in the Q&A at the end. Like, is this because the focus is elsewhere? Or we talked a little bit more about Venezuela, for example.
Well, I think from the perspective of European leaders, they're focused on what's happening closest to them. Greenland is, for them, part of Europe, and it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark being an EU member, and so
NATO.
And so this was part of their focus. Then from Greenland they go to Ukraine. Ukraine also being part of Europe, and these other things then get pushed to the sidelines, at least from the perspective of what the Europeans are focusing on.
Could you see that as this, the start of the end of NATO?
Yes, I mean, I hope, self-interest will lead to a reassessment. Another thing that struck me about Trump's speech, since you asked, is the victimization, like as if the US didn't massively benefit from globalization and this lack of understanding of win-win logics in trades, for example. It suggests that people who are in charge are not competent to me. I also listened to Secretary of Commerce Enoch declaration about that. Like his whole speech was about America first because we've been screwed over during globalization. It's not true,
But this must be for an audience back home, right? They have an affordability back home, and so speeches are never. I mean, they can be what they think, but it's usually targeted towards a specific audience.
Well, it's also targeted to Europeans who don't take it, nicely.
Who
do you think the president was talking to?
He is always trying to, of course, address the MAGA crowd with any speech that he gives, and oftentimes the speeches, quite frankly, aren't tailored to that specific topic. They wander off to certain talking points that he wants to hit on. The other moment that really stuck out for me was the Board of Peace signing. You had all of the big Western leaders staying away from it: Germany, France, Italy, UK, etc. And so that was a moment that really stuck out here this week as well.
Yeah, and I think Canada was then disinvited actually from joining the board.
Yeah, so overnight when on President Trump on his way back to DC. tweeted that he was uninviting Mark Carney, after Mark Carney, of course, gave a very forceful speech here in Davos. It was one of the other speeches that people are really talking about.
And Professor, I mean, was this, again, President Trump trying to take a little bit away from the UN? Then they walked it back, that comment. Like, frankly, it's unclear what this Board of Peace will become.
My takeaway is that, luckily, at last, the Europeans are standing up to a bully who's trying to, I mean, pay for play. Can you believe it? You have to fork out $1 billion or something like that to join. I mean, what is this? This is not how politics should work. So I think it's good that at this meeting, it looked like finally, partners are stopping with the politics of appeasement and going for a sort of a more backbone.
I mean, there was quite a lot of political appeasement, though, right? No one really said this is I mean, they kind of shied away, but I didn't feel like it was a real standing up.
Well, I think we saw a playbook that Trump uses often with big events play out here this week as well. He, before the event, blew everything up so that everyone was talking about him. He comes to the event, and there is sort of the appeasement from both sides a little bit, where they try to kind of agree with one another. And then on the way back home on Air Force One, he starts sending out social media posts again where he's poking at people. And that played out like that also with the NATO summit last summer.
Yeah, what can you tell us about the bankers? I mean, we had quite a lot of stories saying that, Wall Street possibly felt intimidated also by him, which is why a lot of them aren't speaking up.
Well, you saw the lawsuit overnight against Jamie Dimon for $5 billion. People see that these actions, when they speak up, he lashes out. So there are people who are quiet in public. Privately, they will share their views, but they don't want to be targeted personally, and also for their bank to be targeted.
All right, thank you both for joining us. Hélène Landemore, they're professor of political science at Yale University, and Chad Thomas, Bloomberg's executive editor for Europe. Coming up in the week that Donald Trump tackled on tariffs again, we'll be joined by the Director General of the World Trade Organization. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
This week, live from the Alpine Mountains of Switzerland, is the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos. Bloomberg Television brings you unmatched coverage and conversations with world leaders, business executives, and billionaires as they navigate responsible AI deployment, economic expansion, and geopolitical tensions. Tune in for daily coverage all week. Context changes everything.
Welcome back to The Pulse, everyone, live from Davos. Now, the European Union says it's now ready to get back to its agenda following a fractious week with President Donald Trump that included threats to impose new tariffs on European allies opposed to his Greenland plans. Now, with us now is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. Director General, thank you so much for joining us. It's been quite a week here in Davos. I mean, we have many speeches. There was a lot of anxiousness. Is there anything that gives you hope that actually free trade will prevail compared to inward-looking countries?
Well, first, thank you. And you're right, Francine. I think the atmosphere went from a great deal of apprehension to one of a little more hope by the end of the meeting. And I think what gives me hope that we can get back on the agenda on trade is the resilience of the trading system, the global trading system that I showed. Of course, there's been tremendous disruption, the biggest we've seen in 80 years. But we still find that about 72% of world trade is still going on WTO terms. And I think when members of my organization hear that here at the WTO, at the World Economic Forum, it gives them, I think, what they need in terms of an impetus to then do the necessary reforms that can really help the organization meet the future, deal with issues like the new technologies in AI, the opportunities in services trade, in trade over computers, which we call digitally delivered services trade. There are many opportunities.
How would the WTO survive if the U.S. were to retreat from it?
Well, the U.S. has not signaled that it's retreating. The U.S. is still a member, has also, paid its dues and is looking towards paying the next ones. So, and they're active. They've put out a paper on what they think the reforms of the WTO should look like. So we're happy they're there and that they're engaging. It's not easy, to say the least, but they're engaging, so with a very constructive approach. So that's what we see.
Director General, I mean, it's very clear that despite, the tariff wall that we've seen from the Trump administration in 2025, their economy is good. It's fine. You look at inflation, you look at services. How do you explain that?
Well, let me also explain it by explaining that trade was trade growth in 2025 was better than we had projected. Right. After the August tariffs, we projected 0.9% growth in merchandise trade, and we saw 2.4% at the end of the year. And you know why? Part of it was front-loading of goods ahead of the tariffs, but the big part was trade in AI products. 42% of the growth in trade, in goods trade in 2025 was driven by AI trade. And that's why we also say this is the investment propelling growth in the U.S. economy as well, part of it anyway.
Director General, AI trade in terms of what? So this is what they're shifting for building of data centers?
So they need equipment.
I see.
So all the equipment, the hardware, software, all the things being traded to make it possible to build these things contributed 42% to growth in merchandise trade. And the WTO also has an agreement called the Information Technology Agreement that covers about $3 trillion worth of goods that power AI. And so tariffs are low to zero on these goods. And that is also helpful towards propelling this trade.
That's incredible numbers.
Yeah.
Are you expecting that to even increase in 2026?
We are projecting a lower merchandise trade growth this year of 0.5, just because we think that there'll be no more front loading, the impact of the tariffs will begin to come in. However, we see a real potential upside. If this kind of pace of trade in AI goods continues, then we see potentially larger numbers than what we've projected.
Director, how do you see a lot of the reroutes being changed, actually, or being rerouted in trade? I know there's also a lot of anxiousness about what happens in Iran, although that hasn't really been discussed here, the Strait of Hormuz. What are you expecting for this year?
Well, we see a lot of businesses are adapting. And that is why the private sector, they look at the landscape and they try to adapt if they are left alone and given the right signal. So what we see is increasing diversification of trade and people trying to route their supply chains in ways where they can avoid tremendous ways they can deal with uncertainty, because that is the big problem that they have. Businesses don't like uncertainty. So you're seeing more regionalization in the trade. Supply chains are becoming more regional. Within East Asia in particular, we are seeing a lot of this happening. And we actually, in the WTO, welcome that, because we want supply chains to diversify. We have a term for it called reglobalization, but we would like them to go beyond East Asia to Latin America, Central Asia, and Africa.
But is there, does it make it more expensive? But because it's more predictable, they prefer these routes anyway?
Well, I think in some cases, efficiency. So before, the conduct of trade was based a lot on efficiency and trying to get the lowest costs. And that is no longer quite the standard now because of the geopolitics. Some are reshoring, some are producing for the U.S. in the U.S. market, for China in the China market, maybe for the rest of the world, some in Europe and other places. So, yeah, the costs will be higher, but I guess you have to balance resilience with efficiency.
Back in October, the WTO, I think, saw global merchandise trade growing just to 0.5% this year. But given the truce we had with China, could that be higher?
Yes. No, absolutely. For this year, we're seeing a potential upside, and we're going to look at our numbers again very soon. particularly if the truce between U.S. and China maintains, which we're very happy about, and the EU and China also having very productive discussions. We have those big trading blocks, at a steady state. We have AI trade improving. The economy is growing a little bit better, more resilient than we thought. Yes, we could see an upside.
Director General, always such a pleasure to catch up. Thank you so much for joining us. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, they're the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Now, coming up, South Africa's central bank expected to continue easing despite inflation ticking up. We'll get more on the economic outlook with South Africa's finance minister. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to The Pulse, everyone. We're live from Davos. Now, the South African Central Bank expected to continue cutting rates next week, despite inflation ticking higher at the end of last year. Now, with us now, Enoch, Godongwana, the South African finance minister. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. A delight, as always. Now, how would you characterize South Africa's economic outlook for 2026? And what do you see as the main domestic or external pressures?
Let me start by taking a step back and say over the past few years we've been working on some few targets, and we've built in a couple of pillars for the economy. Chief amongst those is macroeconomic stability. On that front, we have achieved a lot of progress. Our debt to GDP has begun to stabilize. We now have got and reduced our inflation targeting to 3%. All of those things are contributing positively to growth. We have embarked on a number of structural reforms which are beginning to bear fruit. As a result of that, we see our economy beginning to tick up. Okay, assuming everything remains the same, we're looking at about 1.8. The headwinds, though.
So should households and companies expect any tax increases in the coming budget?
It's something I can't say. It's something I can't say. My team at National Treasury is always advising me not to raise expectations or do anything before budget. But by and large, overall, it's not something we intend making major substantial taxes. That I can say.
Minister, what is the single biggest risk that could cause this budget's assumptions to unravel if growth or revenue disappoint?
I mean, on the global front, the geopolitical situation poses a risk for us. We don't know how it's going to unfold and what are the implications. As you can see, as you know, South Africa is one of the open economy and embedded in the global economy on the African continent. Anything that happens, particularly in the Western economies, has got serious implications for South Africa. As you would have seen during the global financial crisis, we had a hit on the African continent. So on the global front, that to us is a worry.
But so it could be like a growth shock or tariffs or even a big dollar move?
All of those things. I mean, if, for instance, a trade war materializes between the major powers, it would have a serious impact on us.
Minister, how important is the independence of institutions such as National Treasury or the South African Reserve Bank in sustaining investor confidence, given some of the attacks that we've heard on the Fed?
Look, I can safely say those two institutions have demonstrated resilience and independence over the years, and supported by the constitutional framework which support the independence of those institutions. I think critically they are.
And that, of course, feeds through investor confidence. Is there a direct line into how investors look at your country?
Yeah, it fits through into investor confidence because one of the issues the institutional investors are looking for are credible and independent institutions. To that extent, we can say we're safely sound in that regard.
Can you give us an indication of how negotiations with the U.S. are going on trade and tariff and what you're expecting in the next 12 months?
We are engaged with the USA on trade and tariffs. We've had some time where we were not sure whether we're coming or going. But over the last 3 months, we've been able to table proposals on the table. They've been able to table their counter proposals. And we're engaged in those negotiations where I'm not at liberty to divulge the details of the negotiations.
But are you quite confident that there will be an agreement in the next quarter, in the next 2 quarters?
I'm quite confident that we will have a deal with the United States of America on the trade front.
Minister, how would you describe this Davos?
Davos is an important institution in 2 respects. The first one, there's a lot of the side events. Some of them provide useful information, which we attend. But the second thing is the ability to meet a number of people and network. That, to me, is quite critical, because some of those people you would have needed to travel to a number of different countries. You find them in one place, and in that respect, you save cost. So this is a useful environment.
Away from geopolitics, it was a lot about AI.
Yeah.
How do you see AI changing your economy?
Obviously, AI is quite a critical instrument in changing the economy. The disruption is going to fundamentally change how industries operate. And in that regard, all countries have got to begin to use the technology.
Yeah. And Minister, I mean, we've spoken to a number of ministers, and there's always this tension about, balancing the need to press ahead with fiscal consolidation, whilst at the same time scaling up public investment to support growth and maybe spend a little bit more for the AI transformation. How do you see that balancing act?
The fiscal consolidation is a necessary but insufficient condition for growth. But it is necessary. Without fiscal consolidation, it's difficult to achieve all other associated growth-enhancing policies. In that respect, there's that tension. We have got to maintain fiscal consolidation, but at the same time, parallel to that, you drive some growth-enhancing reforms.
Is it trickier than before because of the need to rethink growth?
It's trickier in the sense that a number of kind of puzzles in the game. We've just talked about AI. There's geopolitical risks. There's a whole range of other things which influence how you respond, how you navigate the landscape.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your time. The most stylish minister in Davos.
Thank you very much.
Enoch Godongwana there, the South African finance minister. Now, Larry Fink, the BlackRock chief executive and co-chair of this year's World Economic Forum, tells us there's no bubble in artificial intelligence, even though some big failures from the technology are going to happen.
I don't think there's any uncertainty about AI. There's no question. Hundreds of billions of dollars is needed to build this out. The CapEx is going to drive more global growth. How that is going to be dispersed and where it's going to be really dependent on each and every government. But I sincerely believe there is no bubble in the AI space. That being said, like in everything else in capitalism, there's going to be some big failures. Okay, we always see a rotation, and there's going to be some huge winners and some losers. But do I believe the needed capital to build out AI is one of the great opportunities for the world to come? When you think about the hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure that's necessary, countries are going to have to rebuild their grids. We're going to have to source new powers of energy. Last night at a dinner, we had an amazing conversation on how AI is going to change science and how it's going to improve human lives in terms of medicine. But importantly, there's a strong foundational belief that AI is going to accelerate new sources of power. And if we could have cheap sources of power, abundant cheap sources of power, maybe things that we can't even think of today through AI, imagine how that could lift the rest of the world.
You announced a big, partnership with Microsoft that you've raised $12.5 billion as part of this, partnership to bankroll data centers.
Yes.
Like, when are you hitting 30 million?
30 billion, yeah.
30 billion. When's that coming?
Well, we announced 12.5. We're actively raising more money. We did already make an acquisition in aligned data centers. The total enterprise value was $40 billion. But not only is Microsoft our partners, MGX of Abu Dhabi, NVIDIA is one of our partners, XAI is one of our partners, and so we have an incredible partnership group in building this out. And we are seeing more and more opportunity working alongside some of the best hyperscalers. And so we see nothing but opportunity, and that, but we have to be judicious and we have to be thoughtful about it. But I'm very encouraged about what AI can do for humanity.
I mean, the way we've covered World Economic Forum is also trying to figure out whether there was a move away from U.S. assets. Do you see that at all, or is it a conversation that you had with the Trump administration?
So if I go back to early Davos last year, I would say the average world investor had an unbelievable over-allocation in dollar-based assets. And I think over the course of last year, we saw probably a 5% reallocation. And that's fine. I mean, when your liability is another currency and you're investing in dollar, I mean, the value of the dollar is an important consideration in your total return. Could there be more reallocation of the dollar? I think the U.S., because of where we are at AI and the amount of capital that's being spent, I think we have the U.S. economy is really growing fast. I mean, we estimate it'll be over 5%, in the first quarter. So we are, the key is now, don't just focus on GDP, because GDP is heavily oriented to all the capex on AI and technology. The key is in that economic condition, are we creating enough great jobs? And so to me, that is what what we need to be focused on, not just GDP anymore, because GDP is going to be powerful. And that's one of the reasons why I am still, I do believe the United States is one of the great places to invest, and will remain to be one of the great places to invest. But having a diversification, that we've seen a little bit here and there, I'm very relaxed about it. I think there's too much noise about that.
Larry Fink there, the BlackRock chief executive and co-chair of this year's World Economic Forum. Now, coming up, we'll discuss the future of space exploration and the balance between discovery and responsibility. I'll be joined by the astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti, next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to The Pulse, everyone. We're live from Davos. Now, the future of space exploration was the subject of a panel, numerous panels here in Davos. Amongst the speakers was the European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, who's been on 2 missions to the International Space Station. I think she was also the first female commander of the ISS, and Samantha joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
We were thinking, actually, after all of the intensity on geopolitics and everything, it'd be nice to speak to you. And then, of course, the team turned around and saying, this is maybe the ultimate space race when we talk about also sending AI data centers. I mean, do you feel that you are actually also in this race where, wars are just brought to space?
Yeah, first of all, great to be here, Francine, and I would just like to correct, I was the first female commander of the ISS from Europe.
From Europe?
From Europe, yes. I think that space is normalizing in a way, right? It's becoming part of our societies, of our economies. And so it's normal that there is also an element of competition that moves into space as well, together with an element of cooperation and fascination with the exploration, of course. But there is an element of competition that touches certainly commercial aspects like, for example, data centers. Now, are we going to see tomorrow data centers in space? I think that is probably a little bit optimistic. I think that that technology still needs to be developed. There's certainly opportunities of using that, always available energy from the sun in space. But whether economically this works out, we're going to have to see in the next years. But it's certainly an exciting idea.
Do you see a lot more competition amongst nations, actually, when it comes to space exploration?
First of all, I think that when we think about space exploration, the first the closest place to us is low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station is. And that is, I think, becoming a normal place where people can go and even have businesses and try to close a business case. And so what we see there is commercial actors coming in and just competing to make money. And I think that's a positive development because it means that more and more actors will come in. The space station, the International Space Station, which is, my home away from home, a place I deeply love, but it will come to an end at the end of this decade. And what we're going to see after that is commercial space stations, which are optimized to offer to other businesses opportunities to do scientific and technical development. So we see a shift there, which I think is positive because the actual frontier of exploration is moving further out towards the moon and further out in the solar system. And definitely there is some competition there as well, mostly between, let's say, the West, if you want, under the leadership of the United States and China. Is it good or bad? I don't know. It is fact, and certainly, if we want to look at it, want to look at the glass half full, competition certainly mobilizes resources very fast, so it can allow you to get outcomes very fast. And then usually what comes afterwards is a period of consolidation, of cooperation, where you consolidate those results and you make them available to everyone.
Can Europe compete? Really, we spoke to Hélène, who was one of the great hopes actually for commercialization of space in Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. Hélène and other founders of startups, I think, are a new generation of founders in Europe who are trying, and we from the European Space Agency are absolutely encouraging that and supporting that. In fact, Hélène and her company, the exploration company, is one of the contracts I'm personally following for the development of cargo vehicles. So can we compete? I think, first of all, we have to catch up. And I don't think that for us is so much about competing at this point. I think for us it's about developing capabilities so that if we need to compete, we can compete. But our preference is always to cooperate, but then we can cooperate as more equal partners. So in space explorations, historically, we have focused on reaping the benefits in terms of doing science and technology development on the International Space Station. But those foundational capabilities of being actually able to, build our own space station, or even more important, the transportation and being able to launch cargo, and potentially one day launch humans, that part we have neglected a little bit. And I always like to remind people that, in all European countries, we hear about European astronauts flying into space. But let's remember, in my case, for example, my first space flight, I flew on a Russian vehicle. On my second space flight, I flew on an American vehicle. My great hope is that future generations of European astronauts also have the opportunity of flying on a European vehicle.
When you say Europe has to play catch-up, is it the technology or is it the funding?
It's both, right? Because they come together. The more money you inject into the system, the more industry is able to develop capabilities. So obviously, they come very much together. It's not like, the fundamentals are here, right? We have great industry in Europe. We have enormous talent. We have great engineers. So it's not like we cannot do it. It's just that, politically, but also industrially, everyone has to agree that this is important and we want to do it.
A lot of people are feeling unsettled because of the rapid changes, because of the potential shocks coming from geopolitics, AI. You are, have amazing leadership advice because you're kind of in the most tense place, far away from everyone, where anything could go wrong with you on the ISS. What's your best leadership advice in these difficult times?
So, to me, the most challenging and yet the most important thing that leaders have to do is to help their people find meaning in this chaos, right? Because when you start losing your sense of purpose and meaning and this conviction deeply inside that what you do makes a difference and affects the future of the world, that's where I think teams fall apart. And it's difficult, it's intangible. Every leader has to find their way to make that happen, but I think it's really fundamental.
What helped you when you were at the ISS?
So I think on the ISS maybe it's a little bit easier because we're there with a very clear mission in mind, right?
Okay.
Where that sense of meaning and purpose is very clear, right? You know, we are there as a crew, very much connected with a much more diffuse and extended crew, if you want, or teams on the ground all over the world. And the mission is very clear, right? We have to deliver science for all those research groups and scientists who worked I don't know, many years sometimes to develop an experiment and then finally flying to ISS. And it's not just, you being there and executing the experiment. Again, it's this whole complex machinery and complex organization that has to come together to deliver that mission.
Thank you so much for joining us. Samantha Cristoforetti, their European Space Agency astronaut, joining us today from Davos. Now, Bloomberg also understands that SpaceX has lined up 4 banks to lead what's expected to be the biggest ever IPO. Sources say Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley are expected to take senior roles. Now, the listing is expected to value SpaceX at $1.5 trillion. Speaking in Davos, the chief executive, Elon Musk, said he sees the cost of going to space falling dramatically.
Hopefully this year we should prove full reusability for Starship, which will be a profound invention because the cost of access to space will drop by a factor of 100 when you achieve full reusability. Right. It's the same sort of economic difference that you would expect that, between, say, a reusable aircraft and a non-reusable aircraft. Like if you have to throw your aircraft away after every flight, that would be a very expensive flight. But if you only have to refuel, then it's the cost of the fuel. And so that's really the fundamental breakthrough that gets the cost of access to space, we think, below the cost of freight on aircraft. So, under $100 a pound type of thing easily. Wow. So it makes putting large satellites into space very low, very cheap. And then when you have solar in space, you get 5 times more effectiveness, maybe even more than that, than solar on the ground, because it's always sunny.
It's cold.
It's always sunny, so you don't have a day-night cycle or seasonality or weather, and you get about 30% more power in space because you don't have atmospheric attenuation of the power.
The SpaceX chief executive, Elon Musk, speaking with Larry Fink, the interim co-chair of the World Economic Forum. Now, what a week it's been here in Davos. Let's bring in Zoe Schneeweiss, Bloomberg's economy team leader for Western Europe, who's also been, helping Chad man the newsroom. And it's been quite, we had 101 interviews overall. There's been many stories. What was your highlight?
My highlight, I'd say there were 2. One of them was Lagarde walking out of that dinner with Lutnick, just doing what European leaders probably aren't brave enough, standing up to the US. I found that quite impressive. The other thing was the whole idea that the forum might be leaving Davos, that there might be this divorce from Davos, although Larry Fink did sort of push back against that a bit. But still, if he puts that out there, and I know, having lived in Switzerland for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, I know how important this is for the country. So any change there would really be, would be just a massive thing.
I like that you mentioned, actually, that Christine Lagarde walked out of that Lutnick. Well, it was a WEF dinner where Lutnick was berating Europe, and so she kind of walked out towards the end. But it goes to the fact that a lot of this Davos was leaders trying to figure out how to handle the Trump administration, like psychologically, how do you keep them on side, but also stand up to them.
Exactly. So Trump, obviously, if you think about the big highlights, Donald Trump being here is one of those things that obviously dominated, that really hijacked the agenda. If I think of past WEFs and now compared to this, everything just was so focused because it was all about Trump Greenland, Trump here, then Trump Peace Board. So all that really took over. And I do wonder with the leaders how much of this really was the European leaders doing something that worked and how much of it was them just getting lucky.
Yeah, and we had, I mean, in our interviews, we had really, people from all over the world. And so we almost got a really good snapshot of the world economy. Who's feeling a little bit vulnerable and who's feeling pretty confident?
I think the situation is that, thinking of the world economy right now, everything just is so uncertain. And I know this isn't the answer you want to hear, but overall, the idea that Trump can change everything so quickly, and we were quite confident on Europe, and then the threat that he could just, on a whim, introduce tariffs just means that Europe will always be vulnerable, and I'm not sure the European leaders have an answer to that.
As always, thank you so much. As always, we've had a good week. It's been a busy week. We go out exhausted, but it's been a good week. Zoe Schneeweiss, Bloomberg's economy team leader for Western Europe. Look, this wraps up our Davos coverage. You can follow all of the highlights at the weekend. We have a number of exclusive interviews. We've spoken to a lot of sovereign wealth funds, and it's, of course, dominated by geopolitics. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.